I have been in your beautiful city since Thursday. It's not my first time here at the invitation of your presbytery, and particularly Clark and Mike, in a conference called Moving Back in the Neighborhood. And that has been a wonderful time because it's been an opportunity to engage with a lot of folk from San Diego. And I say this not to be nice, because it's not who I am. But you are very warm, welcoming, hospitable people. And that's been my experience, and I really enjoy that. I come from Vancouver, which is another one of those cities on the West Coast. We call it the left coast up there. You may call it some other coast down here, but it's also called Lotus Land in Canada, because Vancouver is sort of, as you might know, crushed up between the water and the mountains, and it's an anomalous climate, because when everybody hears that I come from Canada, most folk want to know how cold it gets up there. And I tell them that, well, the ice goes out in June, and it comes back in by late August. And when I went to Fuller Seminary numbers of years ago, this was many, many years ago, before some of you were born. Let's just put it that way. It was in the early 70s. I came down to Fuller and was studying, and Jane was still up in Canada finishing her degree at the University of Toronto. And I actually had friends, still friends, say to me, "What's it like in Canada?" This is a Jay Leno moment, by the way. And I said, well, Canada, and before I could get it out, they said to me, well, are there any cities in Canada? And I began then to get anxious, because I thought, okay. And so I said, well, no, not really. And, it gets really bad up there. And about 3 months in, one of them said to me, well, are you married? And I said, yes, I'm married. Well, what's your wife like? And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, Canada is such a vast country with no cities that men really don't know how to meet women, and so we have this catalog. And so my wife is she came out of the catalog. And so she's arriving. And of course, Jane arrived 8 months pregnant. And it was, I'll never forget it, because we were poor, and a friend gave her this beautiful pregnancy dress, which was red with strawberries all over it. And you got to get the image here of this young woman arriving in this seminary environment where everybody around me believed that what I just said was the case. And in walks this great big strawberry. It was quite a moment. I also remember that time because I went from being the top of the class in Greek, and then Jane arrived, and my grades kind of slipped for a bit at that point. You have spent the summer in the book of Colossians, and we are nearing the end, or you're nearing the end of this text, and I want to read this morning the verses that are before you in your morning bulletin, chapter 4, verses 2 down through 6. And in my Bible, it was never written this way, but in my Bible, the title is Further Instructions, and I've entitled this Final Instructions. And so it begins this way. Devote yourselves to prayer, be watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly, as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make most of every opportunity. Let your conversations be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And this is the word of the Lord. About 2 years ago, Jane and I were she was beginning to look at, I'd been a principal long enough, and I think I want to stop that and become a kept woman. And we talked about this. And you know, some of you won't understand. You reach a kind of a point in life where you're kind of looking at where you've been and how you're going to spend the next little while. And we decided to do something intensely mad and insane. We sold our house of 15 years, and we bought a house that was, we sold a house of about 1,800 square feet, and we went and bought a 4,000 square foot house in West Vancouver, and we hooked up with our daughter, Sarah Jane, and her husband, and their 3 children, who are now 8, 6, and 2, and we all moved in together. And we went from an 1,800 square foot house down to a 1,600 square foot space, and they went from renting and never being able to own a house to owning most of the space. Not owning it, but living in it. And so we kind of moved in together. And we did that for all kinds of reasons. We have 3 grandchildren, 5 grandchildren, but our 3 grandchildren with Sarah Jane all have various kinds of learning challenges in their lives. And you begin to discover that nuclear families are not the best way to thrive in those kind of contexts. So we all moved in together. And we went searching for a house. And one of our criterion were, of course, that there needed to be 2 kitchens. Not because Jane and Sarah Jane wouldn't get along with each other in the same kitchen, but I'm the cook at home, and I don't get along with other people in my kitchen. So, so we moved into this great, big, gorgeous house with a river behind it and wonderful stuff. Great for the kids, and actually are loving it. I want to tell you, at 63 years of age, I would not have it any different. It's like living. I can't imagine saying the kids are gone, let's get into a little box and just be by ourselves. This is an amazing way to live. Now, what I watch, though, are the challenges that we have with 3 challenged kids. And one of the things we did about 2 weeks ago was pull out the whole kitchen downstairs, Sarah Jane and Matthew's kitchen, and we got a whole new kitchen that we're putting together. And so last week, Sarah Jane and Matthew are heading off to Ontario on vacation. And I'd forgotten what it was like when you have 3 kids and you're going away for 10 days on vacation. I've never seen so much luggage in all my life or so much preparation. And so here, you've got to get the picture. The whole inside of the kitchen is gone. We've pulled it all out. There's nothing there. The bits and pieces are now outside that we're going to put in. And it's the night before they get on the plane at 6 o'clock in the morning, because that's the cheap flight. And Sarah Jane is sitting there downstairs, and you can tell, because she's actually a very beautiful woman, so she doesn't look like me, but she's got my eyes in the sense that they kind of disappear into the back of the sockets when she's get really tired. So she's sitting there, and I could see that her eyes had disappeared into the back of her sockets. And but she had a piece of paper in front of her. And that piece of paper were her instructions of here's what now needs to be done, because I'm going away and you're left to look after putting this kitchen in place. So these were her instructions. And that, in many ways, is what Paul is doing in this letter to the Colossians. He is giving them, in one sense, the final instructions. Here's what I want to say to you. Here's what I need you to do, and I need you to be about. Now, I always need to know where folk come from in order to understand them. Why is Paul giving these kinds of instructions at the end of this letter to these folk in Colossae? And you've been in this text for most of the summer, so there's a numbers of things here. We know, for example, that Paul is in chains, which is not a nice metaphor. It means that he's in Rome and he's in prison. And there's a reason why he's in prison. It's that this Christian story which has begun only recently as a Jewish sect, has begun to come up on the radar of Rome. So Paul is in prison not because he has a personal faith in Jesus, but because Rome sees him as an insurgent. Rome sees him as someone who is going about the empire, speaking in ways that are subversive and contrary to Rome. And if you've read the text over the summer, you get all of that. You get all of that in the way, for example, in chapter 2, Paul is talking about who is this Jesus, who was before all things and in all things and over all things. That was not simply praise language. That was articulating a way of life that was antithetical to the very notion of being a citizen of the Roman Empire. And therefore, what Rome is doing is taking people like Paul and putting them in chains and in prison because this message of Jesus is a threat. To declare that Jesus is King and Lord is to say loudly, unambiguously, that Caesar isn't Lord. And to say that Caesar isn't Lord, or simply to say that Jesus is Lord, is to be an insurgent and to be seditious. It is to threaten to undermine the nation. That's why Paul's in prison. And that's what the Colossians are struggling with. Remember that not too many years hence from the writing of this letter, it will be in many parts of the empire illegal to gather together to worship. One of the amazing things about the spread of the gospel in the first 3 centuries, when we know that this was a time of massive growth of the gospel. But here's what we know. Christians, most of the time, certainly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, were not allowed to gather together to worship. They could not, under any circumstances, create printing presses or video clips or anything like that to talk about. You could not do that. Indeed, one of the questions that some of us wrestle with is this question: how could a movement that began in the backwaters of Palestine and spreads to trading centers like Colossae and other places, how could it, by the 4th century, begin to reshape the whole of the world when they could not have worship services, hire staff, do any of that kind of stuff? It had to do, we learned, with something that Paul is getting at here in his final instructions. It's called practices of Christian life. We want to get to that for a moment. So what are Paul's final instructions in these last few verses? How does Paul speak into the Colossian experience? And again, as you know, Colossae is a trading center. There are people moving in and out of it all the time. So Rome is there with all of its political power and might. Greece is there with all its philosophies and all its views and perspectives. And you get this in the midst of the text. And here, in this amazing little epistle, Paul is writing words like this: if you are in Christ, you now live as a community of people in a whole new political reality. That your politics, if you're in Christ, are no longer, are you of the left, or are you the right, or of the up, or are you of the down, but you are of a community that says, first and foremost, Jesus is Lord. And that you are a community who believes that the way of fulfillment, the way of life, is giving yourself to something bigger than just yourself. And what a contrary story, not just in our culture, but also in the Colossian culture. The thing to understand about this text is that everything that Paul is saying is not about a personal experience that I, in the privacy of my heart and life, have with Jesus. It's about a social community who are living in a city that is beginning to say, oh, this isn't just a bunch of Jewish people gathering in a synagogue. This is a subversive bunch of people who don't worship Caesar the way we think they should. And this is a subversive bunch of people who are somehow being shaped by a story that's radically different than ours, and we're not sure we like that. That's the context into which Paul is writing. So, how does Paul respond? What kind of instructions does he give them? There's a tension in Paul. You see it where he begins to talk about some people in Colossae who have brought some new rules to people's lives. You must do this, you must do that, you must cut yourself in this way and in other ways. And so there are some in Colossae that say the way to be Christians is to simply say, here are the nice clear rules, now follow them and you'll be fine. And the other thing that's going on in Colossae, that there are some other kinds of people who are coming in and saying, well, to know Jesus is to really be shaped by certain kinds of Greek spirituality. I don't know whether you use the word spirituality here in San Diego, but it's all over the place, okay? In the churches I pastored, it was all there. I'll never forget one day, I was doing a particular sermon, and I had a picture up on the screen, and it was a picture of Oprah in the Buddhist position. Have you ever seen in the Buddha position, kind of knees crossed like this? And I said, the spirituality of our culture in Vancouver, where we live, is Oprah. Oprah. And I said, more Christians get their spirituality on the afternoon watching Oprah than anything else. And one of the great heroes, because I live on the left coast, is a guy called Tola Eckhart. I don't know if you've ever read his stuff. He and Oprah get together and do their shtick together. And so this spirituality stuff's all over the place. And that was the same as Colossae, where, and when that happens, and I see this in churches all the time, Jesus is kind of an add-on to all of that. I got an email from a friend the other day, a wonderful Christian gal, and I got to go sit with her, and she's just telling us all about the wonderful things that God has been doing. And she said, God has given us, and she went down a list, and there's nothing wrong with this, but she talked about the new horse that they've just bought, and the new big car that they just got, and it was all put in the context of how good God is, and how amazing it is that 5 years ago we dreamt about this kind of thing happening, and now it's all taking place, and how good God is, and how wonderful God is. And I read this, and at one level I want to cry, at another level I want to go, oh my goodness gracious me, this is how deeply the kind of the Oprah me spirituality sinks into the church. That's what Paul is wrestling with in Colossae. So how does he respond to it here? The first thing, 3 points. I'm a Baptist, so that you know I'm getting close to the finish. The first thing that he says is, here's the first practice. The first practice is keep living into God's big picture. Keep living into God's big story. Because here's what we're wrestling with, folks, in North America. We're wrestling with the fact that everywhere we turn, the story that we are given is that we are at the center of everything. And what has happened is that in churches and the way we sing and everything else, it says God is all about meeting our needs. God is about meeting our personal needs, our spiritual needs, our public needs. God is about me. And what Paul is wrestling with here is that God isn't about you. God is up to something that is so much bigger than you. And here's what's going on. This is why he talks about the mystery that's been revealed from before the foundations of the earth in Jesus. This is why Jesus is so central and so important. Why? Because from before the foundations of the world, God has been up to something. And it's this, that this whole universe, this is the mystery of Jesus, this whole universe, not just people, not just this creation, this world, but this whole universe in ways that you and I don't understand is going to be brought back together and healed and made one and is going to live in an amazing doxology to God the Creator. That's what Jesus is up to. And you see, the reason Paul is in chains is not because God's met all his needs. Believe me, it ain't the case. The reason that Paul is in chains is because he has been invited to get onto that train, to become part of a journey that's bigger than him, that takes him into places that he never wanted to go and he never imagined he could go, because God's up to something bigger than us. That's what Paul means by being in chains. He's in chains. And so, the first practice is, how do we keep reminding each other that this story is bigger than me? It's bigger than me. The second thing that Paul does is what we call invite people into what's called the inward and the outward journey. This is very old. A number of years ago, I was on the Isle of Lindisfarne in northern England, just off the east coast, which is called the Holy Isle, where the Celts went in the 3rd century. I was up there because I'm a member of the Northumbria community, which is just in from the coast. And you may know that the Celts, these early amazing missionaries, went to the Isle of Lindisfarne, and from the Isle of Lindisfarne, they basically missionized, transformed all of northern England. And the reason they went to that isle was because they wanted the tides to remind them that to be Christian is to be shaped in a rhythm of life. And when you live near the oceans, you understand this, that there's a rhythm to the tides. They come in and they go out. And what Paul is saying here is that there's a rhythm to the practices that we need of Christian life. There is a coming in and there is a going out. And there is a way of coming in and there's a way of going out. And so the inward journey that he talks about has to do with what he talks about 3 things: prayer, thankfulness, and attention. Let me say something about prayer. What Paul means here isn't learning how to serendipitously pray for oneself or pray for one another, which is good. What Paul means is building into one's life every day a regular practice of prayer. Now, what does that look like? 2 quick examples. You may remember several years ago in an Amish community on the East Coast that a man driving a truck drove up to a schoolhouse where the Amish kids were, walked in and shot them. If you remember that story? The news media went down there and were reporting. And what the news media were looking for was, how are these Amish going to respond to this grief? And when they saw that the Amish, almost from the get-go, were both extending forgiveness to the man that did it and his family, as well as caring for one another, the news reporters began to say, well, see, these silly people who live off in the corner are in denial. They don't know how to get angry. They don't know how to get mad. They don't know how to want to take out the person that did this. They're obviously maladjusted. A friend of mine, Conrad Carnegie, who grew up in an Amish community, and became a Mennonite and is a sociologist who teaches at a university back east. He says, Al, people don't get this. You see, every day, 5 times a day, in the Amish community, no matter where you are and no matter what you're doing, in the midst of what you're doing, you say the Lord's Prayer. And so every day, 5 times a day, you say things like, and forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are debtors against us. And Conrad said, you see, what they don't understand is when you live into that practice, it becomes who you are, not external to who you are. This is what Paul is about. When you live in the midst of a culture that say it's all about me, and it's all about the instant, and all about what I can get and how I can get it, and whether church meets my needs or doesn't meet my needs. You don't survive in that kind of culture by taking courses. You survive in practices every day, speaking the prayer or whatever the rhythm of life that you would need. And so Paul is inviting them into prayer and to thankfulness and attention. I don't have time to look at all of those. But he's also looking and inviting them into an outward journey. And this outward journey is about being wise towards those who are outside and acting in ways that are full of grace. And again, let me just land on this word grace for a moment. I'm very aware that I live in a culture where people love definitions. And they think if you've got the definition, you've got it. And I hear Christians all the time tell me, well, I know what grace is. It's God's unmerited love to me. And I go, yeah, that's nice. Or I know what grace is, and then they get into this whole nostalgia thing about singing Amazing Grace in 1,000 different ways. I don't know what grace means to you, but let me tell you what grace means to me. Because you see, Paul, if you read these texts, isn't about definitions and airy-fairy ideas. Paul's about something that actually happens. So I can only tell you this out of my story. I grew up in post-war England, in Liverpool, an old dock city that was declining and fading, where employment amongst youth was 80%. My playgrounds were bombed-out buildings. I ran around big cement machine gun posts all over the place. Now, I didn't know that was unusual or strange. My life was the streets, and by the time I was 12, I and my friends never went off our street unless we had knives and axes and other things hidden inside our clothes. And without any sense of pride, I was getting to the place by the time I was 12 where I was running away from street fights, leaving axes embedded in other people's bodies. I was learning how to set fire to houses. And I was an angry, angry, angry boy because I picked up the atmosphere of a culture, of a city that felt oppressed and had nowhere to go. Here's what grace is about. That for reasons that have absolutely no explanation, God came and called and rescued me and invited me to enter his big story. And therefore, all of my life is shaped by this deep sense that for reasons for which I have no explanation, God took a hold of me and said, you're going on a journey. And this is just good Calvinism, God called me on that journey, not just to rescue me from something, but to invite me to become part of a people who are the sign and the witness of where God is taking all of creation. And so when I go back to Vancouver tonight, and I get off the plane, and I drive into my neighborhood, and I stop my car beside my neighbor's, and I get out, and I join the neighborhood party that's going to be going on there this afternoon, I step out as one who lives in the grace of God in that story. And I receive others in that way. Paul lived in a big story. Paul understood it was about a life shaped around practices, the inward practices of prayer and thankfulness. And it was a life that entered one's neighborhood with a deep sense of recognition that God has called me and given me life. How do I do that to my neighbors? God be with you.